All right, folks, I think we've got everybody here. Let's get started. Couple of announcements, per usual. First of all, the full suite of project levels for the Node.js project is now up and available on Polylearn. What I did was took the Rust document and augmented it with some color-coded sections, and they are respectively version 2 and 3. So there's also a spec itself formally saying so, but most of it's in the Rest document. Take a look at that. We're also, as needed, tweaking the Rest document when it has made mistakes of one sort or another, mostly as you explore things that we didn't correctly specify or fully specify. There is now a separate copy of it up on Polylearn, not in the zip file. It didn't seem sensible to keep posting a zip file. And I will, on Polylearn, put, first of all, a history of changes. There are 2 of them in there right now. And I'll red mark the spec itself, too, where the changes did occur. So if you need to keep track of that, just look at that little segment on Polylearn, and it'll say what changes occurred on what day, and red marks. These are all small things. They shouldn't be hard to fix if you have implemented them per the spec as opposed to per the new spec. They're trivial things. If anything was major, we'd give more time. The deadlines, as already promised, are tonight, and then Monday and Thursday of next week for the next 2 versions. But we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute here. Jonathan is patiently doing grading of submits at this point. He hasn't promised to do them instantaneously, but he'll be doing perhaps some more this evening at some point. So mail your URL link directly to him. It's simpler than doing it to me. You'll get faster response, first of all, and that way we don't possibly lose an email. And I would suggest his Poly email, which is jnico19 at calpoly.edu. All right, so send that off to him. Our testing policy is that we want to see that you've done a pretty thorough job. If we run it against our standard suite that we have personally created and you're blowing a lot of stuff, all you're going to get back from Jonathan is, hey, pull your socks up, do a little bit of job, please, try again later. And you'll get around to it in another few hours or a day or so. And so it's worth your while to get it right the first time if you can. Otherwise, there's a delay and you may lose some points. If you're close and we feel like you did a good job, he will actually send you our test suite, which you are to keep confidential, please. But that way you can look at exactly what we're doing and make sure you answer to it precisely. We can short circuit a lot of go-rounds that way. But you got to be close. Right? We really want to see it down to like 1, maybe 2 bugs for that to happen. Don't forget, this is all individual work at these phases. Versions 1, 2, and 3 are to be done individually. It's class standard. The group project, the 4A project, is a team project, and that's a different cup of tea. But I want people to establish their own ability to do this stuff before they dive into trying a project with a partner. And that's what the standard regarding individual work is for. Let's see here. Oh, yeah, final point on testing policy. I forgot to mention this. This is traditional in all my classes. The definition of midnight is flexible. In particular, there are several ways to phrase it. Midnight lasts all night long is one of them. The other is if you haven't slept yet, it's still yesterday. So bottom line is if you get the thing in at 3 or 4 in the morning, we'll figure that was the day before. And you're still on time for midnight of the day in question, right? Let's talk a little bit about this weekend. Because this 5-week class is weird, and it catches up with you if you're not careful, and will surprise you. If you look closely at it, first of all, our final exam is by the standards. It's a rule. I have to do it on Thursday of the 5th week of the class. So one way to look at what I'm going to communicate is there are exactly 3 class meetings in this class after now, before the final exam. Another way to look at that would be we are, in effect, entering dead week next week. So this is kind of the make or break weekend if you're catching up and getting this stuff done. You're not alone if you haven't got it version 1 finished yet, but you really can't let this get too far behind given the tightness of the time frame. Especially if you're considering doing an A-level project. Pretty much if you're doing an A-level project, you need to be figuring on getting versions 2 and 3 done this weekend and have them cleared probably by Tuesday. If any questions or problems. That's not when they're officially due. But people who are done with those by Tuesday, I'm going to be authorizing to then seek partners if they want to do a independent project and to begin work on the back end of that. You'll have Node.js as much as you need to do just about anything you need to do. And you'll be able to talk with a partner, sort out a spec, and it does need to be a REST-based project, that's a requirement. Get a REST specification done and start implementing. So you can begin your project fully, wow, a week and 2 days before the final. Next week I will cover Angular.js. But on looking at this and given the tightness of the time frame, if you choose to use jQuery alone for your front end, you're welcome to do so. And the means for doing so will be discussed today. I'll go through our mastermind front end example in jQuery using jQuery UI. That's also in the recorded lectures. So it's all available to you if you want to do that. I'm trying to get this way clear to get the project rolling along as fast as possible. So consider those possibilities. And then if you want to use Angular, well, we'll at least have the coverage done by, if it goes to plan, by the next Thursday. You'll have a week before the final exam to do that. So I didn't want to dump all this on people on the 4th of July weekend. I figured that was a vacation weekend. But this weekend, man, this should be a working weekend in this class. And if you think it's irrational, remember, it's in 5 weeks. This is effectively an 8-unit class for all intents and purposes. It's just, it's over quickly. So all you got to do is put up with this for about another 2 weeks or so, and then it's all done. We will try to offer a little slack after the final exam for people who are trying to get projects done, maybe on the Friday or Saturday, but I'm not sure how much I can because I am required by law to submit grades at a certain point. And my experience with continuing ed, who tends to run these off-season courses, is they get really pissy, frankly, about grades that are even a little bit late. So I have to get them in. That's the deal. Any questions on this tightness of schedule issue? If I put the fear of the Lord into people and everyone's ready to focus in, good. I want to see everybody get through this and hopefully with an A. A final point, I have put up modules for JS and then for REST and HTTP, they're on the Polylearn site. And in fact, the REST HTTP ones, I said at the time, you don't need to go into jQuery yet. That was true when I posted them, but as of tonight, you do need to go into the jQuery as well. The content in the recorded lectures is testable material. So I do expect you to understand what went on in those recorded lectures. Doesn't mean you have to go through every last little tiny detail in them, but they do have concepts of importance. They do reiterate what I'm doing in class. I want to be sure that, if I ask you, what are the 5 false values in JS, you know the 5 false values in JS. And I ask you questions like the in-lecture questions in the recorded lectures. In fact, come to think of it, I'll probably skim through those and pick 1 or 2 of the in-lecture questions just for the heck of it as a final exam question, because I meant them as good thought questions when I designed the lectures. So it's worth your while to be studying those and going through it. And you don't have to listen to my voice, especially not at the slow speed if you don't want to. Remember, if you want to move through them fast, there is always the transcript material, and that will cover everything, and you can blast through it fast. Or if you like listening, well, the YouTubes have a ×2 speed factor on them, and you can do that too, right? Okay. So, without further ado then, let's talk about some stuff we did not quite get to last time around. A question?
How is the grade breakdown for the project? Because it's like project 1 is due now, and it's like 5% off per day.
Yeah.
How does that like add in?
The project 1, version 1 isn't going to be too heavy because it's just the very first thing.
But it's like, let's say like 20% on grade, then like each day after is 15, and then if we go for the next 2 or 3, is that just its own thing?
Yeah, they're each independently penalized. And honestly, I don't know that I'm going to put a late penalty on anything past the version 3 of this project, because at that point we're 1 week from the final, and my intent in late penalties is not to make your life hell, it's just to make sure that you get on it.
Yeah.
And I figure that when we're a week away from the final, most people have already figured they're going to be getting on it, so I don't need to do anything more with late penalty. We'll just make it all due by the end of the quarter or the term and be done with it. So let's see here. Last time we talked in a good bit of detail about the jQuery library, the marvelous rewrite and added layer that allows shuffling around to the DOM in all sorts of method-chained, highly elegant ways. And I culminated with an example that was like 18 lines and added an expander to an otherwise static set of HTML. I also established certain patterns in there that we'll be using all along today. The idea that you could start with a static HTML structure, write some JS that would go in and rework it, maybe add in new stuff like those up and down buttons, and throw in event handlers that make stuff happen, so that what you might almost think of as a dead skeleton turns into a living organism as a result of this kind of code. That's very much the way the jQuery UI library we're going to be looking at operates. It's like a bunch of expanders, but different types of UI. Same philosophy, same approach. Okay. Before we do that, we do need to look at one other thing, very important, that jQuery offers. We've been dealing with REST interfaces, and thus far have been interacting with them through Postman only. But obviously implied in all of this is that we will be building JS applications that will run in the browser and that will talk to the REST interface that we provide to get work done. So how does that look from JS? How do you write JS code to talk to a REST interface? And the answer is it depends on the library you're using, but jQuery offers a quite representative sample of such a library, and the jQuery Ajax code is what I want to look at here. What I'm going to do to start with is a very simple example that's also in the lectures, and this uses a REST interface that does something quite similar to our challenge interface. It's actually designed especially for Mastermind, since that was the example project in JS, and it seemed natural to extend that into the jQuery discussion. So it's a Mastermind REST interface that will be very familiar if you look at the docs. It's provided in the course materials. I don't know that I'm going to go into it in great detail here because you've already seen a very similar one. It's got a persons resource. It's got a mastermind attempts, MMA resource. It's start a mastermind attempt. And then the concept of what we would call a step is a move instead. And a move is you make a guess, you get a result. And we keep a list of moves for each attempt. So again, a quite familiar pattern, but very specialized to mastermind because that's the working example. Okay, with that, I'm writing a little squib function here, a squib HTML. The full app we'll look at in a minute. And I just want to find out how many attempts I've made. And we'll do that by logging in and then doing a REST call to do a get on the attempts for me, right? And I'll return a count. So first of all, there's an HTML file, count attempts, and this is a very small web app, basically. It does a listing. It looks like this. Let's see what we got here. There. That's what it'll look like. It'll have 3 edit boxes in which I can enter first the REST host that or domain that I need to get to. It's designed to contact any REST server, and then my email and password to log in. And I press count my attempts. It's not actually working right now. I couldn't get it working. The other one is, but this one, for some weird reason, I just didn't sort it out. It isn't too necessary because it's only a page of code. But if I click this, it's supposed to come up with a little edit or a bit of text in the HTML that says how many attempts I've made. Right? So let's look at how the logic for that would work. First of all, and this is one of those I'm going to ask you, I apparently have an count attempts class, which is right here in this JS file, which does all the logic, right? And I would like to configure that. It has a configure method in it that goes and works the HTML and does to it whatever event handling magic I need to do, kind of like what we looked at earlier, that added things to the expander and so forth. So my setup is going to be make one new count attempts object and call configure on it. Remember from last time, what is the $sign for? The script will cause this to be executed, this code, line 8, immediately as it goes through the HTML file. So why in particular didn't I just do a direct new mmconst.configure call and get it configured? What would have gone wrong had I done so? And where'd the dollar sign come from while we're at it? So, Stephen, what do you think?
Dollar sign is basically the jQuery wrapper.
Mm-hmm. It is the one and only thing jQuery has to the global space. And it is everything. It is a function, it is a constructor, actually, of jQuery objects. It's all wrapped up in one. What the heck do I pass it a function for? What does that mean? It's one of the 5 uses of the thing.
Yeah, one of the 5 uses is that if it reads in the function, it will what exactly it does.
So kind of a related question, and probably one good one to think about. What if I just eliminate that? Let's just drop that out of there altogether. And this too, all right. I don't need all that garbage. Once this jQuery fanciness for, let's just call the damn configure thing. That's what we want, right? That ought to do it. And we can assume configure will go in, work the HTML, do searches for certain tags, and add event handlers, and do whatever it needs to them, and that'll all be great. Actually, no, it won't. Significant problem will arise from this. So what is the problem? Renee, what do you think? Well, I'm running a script command here at the top of my HTML file, right? And if you put a script instruction in the header, it'll be executed at that point as the HTML file loads. And I'm doing a configure call, which will go and work this HTML down here in a manner very similar to the thing the expander did. It'll go and find, it'll find this ID URL, which is the input for text, and go and get that data and use it for the URL for the REST interface. We'll see the code in a bit. But it is definitely going to work with the HTML, and that's the operative fact here that is kind of implies the answer to the question. So what's wrong with just calling that configure to run right now? It's all about timing as the web pages load. So that's what I want you to think about here. Paul? And it's the after the page loads phrase. It's very critical here. It's easy to look at this and say, well, it's a page. Boom, it loads. No, it's not that way. This is a web connection. It's loading the HTML, and that can come in chunks. If it's a big page, it will come in chunks. It's not going to come all at once. And so if you just run this right now, right off the bat, your page ain't there yet. And all sorts of weird things are going to fail. Not only will they fail, but they may fail unpredictably because maybe the page is there one time you load it because it got there fast. But other times it's not there because there was some network slowdown. And so you're asking for it if you don't carefully make sure that any JS you're going to run that works the DOM, right, the document object model, the HTML tree that the page represents, is performed after it's fully loaded and ready. And there are a number of ways of doing that. It used to be a real tedious mess because every browser had their own approach. And jQuery solves that by offering you the option of passing a function to the $sign. And understand that because I am now passing a function to $sign, the $sign will execute right now, which means it'll salt that function away and hang on to it with some sort of event handling that we don't have to worry about that will then eventually run it. But it certainly will not run configure on line 8. That function is wrapped in being saved away like an event handler. Yeah.
I'd seen the $.ready, I think. Is there a difference between that?
I have to look it up, but I believe not. I think it's the same deal. The .ready is just a more explicit way of saying it. And by the way, in case I didn't mention it last time, I think I didn't. I did it in the lectures. Again, a reason to look at those recorded lectures. jQuery, literally, is a synonym for $. Did I say that last time around? I think I did briefly now that I remember, yeah. Now, why would you want a synonym? Why do you need jQuery as opposed to, isn't one name good enough? $sign is brief, right? But it's also overloaded. People like using that name, and there are other libraries that use it too. And if you load that one in, they're going to fight with each other. So you're guaranteed that jQuery, hopefully no one uses the global name jQuery except jQuery. So if you want the longer name, you can use it. Yeah. All right. So now the only question is, what does configure do? Well, here it is. First of all, count attempts itself is a constructor, and it apparently sets up a series of values: email, URL, password, show button, and message list. All right. And again, a reminder or a question for you, just to get people warmed back up again. What is this notation on line 2, and for that matter, 3, 4, 5, 6, and what is that notation doing? What's this $? What's this pound about? What kind of thing ultimately is going to be assigned into email and into URL and thus forth? And by way of reminder, by the way, we do have, it's worth noting, see that, and that, and that there, all right? And then there's one that isn't even visible. It's a UL, a unnumbered list in HTML jargon, and it's got an ID as well. And there's one down here for the show button that you punch to count my attempts, right? And so, David? David. Name straight. David Yeager. Oh, okay.
Oh, I'm not.
Hang on, David. I think so.
I'm
Yeah, yeah. I said David. I'm sorry. Glasses on, but my apologies, Daniel. I'm slowly getting these. We're only in the 4th, 5th class meeting, whatever. So,
So it gets the text.
it gets the text, but I'm looking for a little more specific. What's the $ thing going on here again?
Well, the dollar wraps.
Close. So first of all, what is this notation with the pound? What's that for? Now, what is that string? There's a name for it, actually. I imagine most people won't get it either. So, yeah. Selector. It's a CSS selector, right? Elaborate little syntax, has all sorts of ways of describing which HTML you want to get. The pound means identifier, ID. So, ID of email. That's describing that HTML thing. And then the $ gets me what exactly? It doesn't get me the text. That's not quite the right way to visualize it. In fact, by the time I'm done, email is a reference to a thing that has a reference to another thing. Both of them JS objects with classes even. Did you have thought on it, McKay? A HTML element, to use the full name, actually capitalized all the way to the E, HTML element is a class. Yeah, there's an HTML element involved in here, but that's not what email points to. So what does email point to when we're done? The wrapper. The what kind of wrapper? jQuery wrapper. It's a jQuery wrapper. So the pattern you want to have in mind, and you should see this into your head. I got a wrapper, which then points to an element, right? Remember this discussion from last time around. So there'll be an HTML element for the edit box that the email identifier applies to, the input box to be exact, this thing. Right. That will have an HTML element, but the $ will wrap it with a jQuery object, which has better methods than the HTML element does. And that finally is what we'll save in email, right? And likewise for all the others. So we're setting that up as a bunch of jQuery objects. And then the configure function comes down here. And this is where we get into making the connection to the REST interface. But first, this .show button, let's see, this .show button is the button jQuery object that we just made, right? And then the .click method allows us to set up an event handler, right? It will occur when the button is clicked. And we pass the handler this function, right? And we presume then that when we click it, this function will be called. And all this $.ajax stuff is communicating with the REST interface. We'll get there in a minute. But I do want to do another one of these kind of reminder things. At one point, I'm going to use the URL that we set up here. That's the input for the domain to use, the local host or whatever that I'm using for my REST connection. And then .val, when you have a jQuery wrapper around an input box, will get you the actual value in there. So if I entered in such and such localhost :8080, that's what will come out of there. And apparently I'm using that as part of what is called an AJAX call, which is a client-side call to the REST interface. I get more detail on that in a minute. But I am concerned about this, self.url. URL is in the countattempts object. It's a member of the countattempts object. It was this.url here. Why is it self.url down here? And even more deeply, if I just put this.url, wouldn't that do just as well? What would I get and why? Jacob, what about you?
He's saving the object that calls it, and then so you have to do self.url, so each one has its own URL, and it's not just all of them pointing back to the same one.
Well, why wouldn't... There's only one URL object in this whole thing. There's only ever going to be one. So if I put this.url there, what will happen? And apologies if I keep hammering on this, but this is a common source of bugs and confusion in all this kind of coding, so I really want to get it all locked down. You should not only know that you have to, well, one of the things I don't want people doing, okay, is just saying, oh, you do var self equal this because Christ, that makes it work, right? There are people who code that way in JS, and they're dangerous. You don't want to be one of them. You should be able to look at that and say, you know, this is why it won't work. In fact, this is exactly what will go wrong if you do this dot. What will happen? What will this be if it isn't what I'm expecting? And why, right? So, let's see here, we talked, well, Leon. Yeah.
Isn't it that like this could change when that line of code is actually ran?
Right, and I like the phrase, when that line of code is actually run, because you're being carefully conscious that this function is not going to run right now. This is later, like maybe a year from now, if I leave the thing running and come back every year, press the damn button, then it'll run finally. And what will this be exactly? Be bonus if you can tell me exactly what this will actually be in an event handler.
The most recent. I'm not sure if it's the last one in whatever shell.
Not quite. It's something I mentioned only in passing. So let me reinforce it though, because it is useful to know. An event handler, as far as I know, almost invariably gets as this the HTML element that the event occurred on. So when it runs the handler, it'll effectively jam this as the HTML element. And sometimes that's useful to have. For one thing, you can get stuff off of that. And I think we did deal with that actually in one of the earlier examples, because you remember that we took this and then $signed it to get a wrapper around it. So when you're in an event handler, you may count on this being the HTML element on which the event was called. But that, of course, is not the countattempts object. And so the solution, as in general with Clojure, when you want to retain the this, knowing that in a subfunction that is later to be called, it will change, you say var self equals this, right? Some people do that equals this. Everyone has their own favorite word for the thing we're using to say this, but self is the one we'll use here. All right, with all that in mind, then let's get down into the show button thing. Click. AJAX. Asynchronous Java and XML, I believe, is the original definition, which is misleading because we're going to be sending JSON, not XML. But there's a little bit of interesting history surrounding this. Okay? AJAX kind of took the field by storm, as I recall, early 2000s. And before that, the rule was you sent the browser, the web server, a URL, and you got back a page. And if you wanted to change anything, you sent it a URL, maybe with some more information like get parameters or what have you, and got back a whole other page. And websites were really kind of clunky back then. It might even be long enough ago that you don't remember that, but everything was a full page reload. even a minor change was a full page reload, because there was no way in the libraries at the time to say, look, I want to keep this HTML. I don't want to change this HTML. I just want to go in and get some information, like REST calls, and then use that to tweak the HTML. Right? And as I recall properly, I think it was actually a sneak path. It wasn't even intended. And some browser, I think IE didn't want you doing this or something like that, but they found a way around it, and suddenly, boom, the world exploded because they could do this. It wasn't even intentional. It was an accident. But they grabbed it and used it, and now it's a feature and you can't get rid of it, and so they decided to standardize it instead. And this is when you began to see things like, Google being able to do completion of entering of your search keys, because that's an Ajax thing going on. The page is not being reloaded every time you type a character. It's doing some dynamic check against the REST service at Google as each character is typed to see what appropriate completions would be, right? And libraries for that thus still have the term Ajax attached to them. And an Ajax call is made here using jQuery. Right? It's a property of the $sign. The $sign is the Ajax constructor as well, right? The jQuery constructor, forgive me. So a whole lot of functions get attached to that $sign that are related to jQuery, and we're going to see more as jQuery UI comes in. So the idea of sticking functions onto the $sign so that you can do other things is a common jQuery deal. Right? So Ajax, you pass it a JSON object. Notice the opening curly brace right there. And the JSON object has various fields, not all of them required. You can look up the details. There are a great many of them, in fact, some more obscure, others quite common. The JSON object in question is terminating down here on line 31, and that's the end of my Ajax call. Okay? So you pass it not explicit parameters, but one big JSON object. And that is an idiom, by the way, that I don't know we've seen that much of in JS yet, but you'll see it fairly often in JS design. If you have a function that takes an elaborate set of parameters, possibly as many as dozens, each with a different name if it were a parameter, you could make a dozen-long parameter list, but it'd be really tedious, easily error-prone. I mean, this isn't Java, right? So it wouldn't even be type-checked. You could get them in the wrong order easily. And so the solution is instead, in such sophisticated parameter list cases, you pass a big JSON object. And now you know darn well what each one is because it's got a property name. There's no ambiguity about it. The closest analogy in other programming languages is named parameters. And there are languages that let you specifically say which parameter you're passing a value to by giving the parameter name. This is how that's done in JS. Okay? So obviously you need the URL. You got to tell it what URL you want to go to, just like when you're doing Postman, you put that in first. And that'll be our URL that we entered, remembering that Val gets the actual entered thing out of the input field, plus sessions. It's going to be a post. You've got to tell what type it is. Actually, you don't. If you don't say otherwise, it's a get. So you can leave it default if you want to get. Remember that the type of content matters. And in fact, there's two ways on that. The outbound content and the return content. This, if I recall correctly, is the return content. I'm expecting content that will be application JSON. Cross domain. You don't see that very often. And the reason it's in this is that we're setting it up so that we could use a local file, HTML, and hit a remote server. Right. I'll do a brief aside on the single origin protocol in a little bit, SOP. But for now, let's just leave that by. It has to do with that protocol. Right. The data I will send. I'm going to send it a JSON string. And remember that you can't just send an object. If you want a string that is JSON, you have to do JSON.stringify. And so I'm giving it the values from my email and my password. That's straightforward enough, and that's what's expected in the body. Right? And I think I was wrong about the content type being the response. I think that's the request body type. Now, this will send off a REST request. Back will come a response. The two final fields, success and error, are functions to call back once the call is complete. As the names imply, one to call if the function call is successful and the other if it is a failure. Now, you can get more detailed information from the parameters themselves as to exactly what the error code was and so forth. But very often, all you want to know is, was it a 200 or not? And that's good enough. And that is the differentiation between these two. The three parameters, again, are a little bit detailed. This is the body. The XHR is the header, as I recall, of the response. I forgot what status was. It may just be the status code. I have to look this stuff up every time I use it. But these are the pieces that will give you detail on the response. And then you don't have a body, or I guess you presume not to have a body. I think the packet is the body on the error as well. That's right. And then the status, again, is the status code. So those are the two callbacks. Remember, they may happen at any time. It may be a while before they come back to you. We then have two functions we're going to call login success, login error, using our self, and they're down here. So remember, the first one is being passed the data, and then XHR, which is the full information about the response packet, and in particular has the headers in it. We renamed it from XHR, which is the traditional name for those calls for some reason, and packet is a better name. You can get the response header from it. And so we want our location because we want to know what our session, or actually our person ID is. The way this REST interface works, the location it gives back weirdly when you get a new session is the person ID that is logged in. I wasn't that good at designing REST 3 years ago when I wrote this, and so that's what it does. It really shouldn't, but that's how it works. Another self is this. The message list. That's the unnumbered list that we had here that is prepared to give me either a successful count of my number of attempts or some indication of error. I'm going to make sure it's empty first. Sorry. Make sure it's empty first because it might have content from an earlier attempt. I might have pressed the button earlier and gotten a result. I'm going to clear it out. And then I'm going to append to it a list item describing that I am logged in, this is the successful one, and what URL I'm logged in as, which is the URL that was my location from the get response header, right? So my person URL. $sign here is doing what? Yeah. If somebody want to give it a try, or I'll choose them if no one wants to give it a shot. But Kevin, would you? And it's another one of the uses of $sign, Swiss Army knife, right? Yeah. It is wrapping, sort of. It's doing more than wrapping, because there's no HTML. It's not like I got a pound ID here. It's not going to the HTML DOM and finding something to wrap. Not quite. Yeah.
You're trying to identify strings, like in this case, the tags.
Yeah, maybe is it trying to identify it by the time? No, there's nothing like that in the. I mean, you can see the HTML. I don't have any list items in there right now, right? It is spontaneously creating a DOM subtree containing just what would be generated by that HTML. And it can be longer HTML if you want. It doesn't have to be just one tag. It can be a bunch of nested stuff, and you'll get this subtree. It's not part of the DOM yet. You have to attach it. But very often you want to create spontaneously pieces of HTML that are going to be attached into the DOM, and the $sign will let you do that. It's remarkable, too, as I mentioned last time around, that it actually parses the string to determine whether it's valid HTML, and works that way, because the other alternative is to pass it a CSS selector, which is also a string. But it's not HTML. And so it's smart enough to distinguish which one you want to do based on what your string content is. Thus, we are creating a list item to attach to message list, and we're using the append jQuery method to attach it onto that message list as a child. And so it will appear. Are we done? No. I'm supposed to count the number of attempts, right?
Sorry about that.
Oh, good. I'm supposed to count the number of attempts and say how many I have, and that requires another REST call. So I'm going to do another AJAX call. This time I'm going to take my URL, which is the person URL, PRSS1, if that's who I am, /MMAs, which is my list of mastermind attempts, and do a get for that. And once again, I'll have success and error, and we'll get back either data that has one field in it, length, and this is like response.body, right? Same kind of thing. And we're going to look at the data length and put that in a list item in the same fashion. So now it'll be you're logged in as so-and-so, you have so many attempts. Or if it fails, we'll say we had a general error getting attempts. And by the way, if we have an error on the first login, we'll just say login error. That's the end of this small example. From the top, fairly standard pattern. If you're working with AJAX, you're going to go first, sort out the HTML, get some event handlers, do what you need. And then when it's time to go get information, you can make AJAX calls. The AJAX calls will have success and error callbacks. And they are asynchronous in the fashion we've become accustomed to in Node, except that these are on the client side. And very often, one of those may do a further AJAX call once the first AJAX call completes. I've designed stuff that had like 3 or 4 AJAX calls. I won't quite say in a row, but each in the handler of the prior one, in a fashion that is somewhat reminiscent of Pyramids of Doom, except that in this case it's in separate functions at least. But still, it can be rather tedious to keep track of. And there's a method to avoid some of that Pyramid of Doom behavior called promises, which we'll get to at another point next week. Right? Somewhat like the waterfall idea. Any questions on this example? Okay. So that's our simple AJAX illustration. Time for the real application. This is the mastermind client, and it hopefully actually runs. I spent some swearing time last night getting a server dusted off from 3 years ago, and all the code rot that had occurred since then. The way this thing operates is that you have 2 menus up here, which is really kind of old design, but I at least wanted to show how a jQuery UI menu would work. And you log in or register. And there's a settings, and this is a glitch that shouldn't be hidden under there. We'll have to worry about that later. But the options bring up dialogues. So if I want to register, right now I don't have one in my Cal Poly name, so I'll throw one in there. X is always a good password. And then I can log in as that person if I want to, hopefully. The other one works, I know that. And this being a relatively simple app, it's not going to hide my password at all. So now I'm logged in as this new user. And I can start a game of Mastermind. Oh, and I should have mentioned, the options up here, another dialog, lets me set how I want my Mastermind configuration to be. This is like the initial options F41 type of thing we had in our text version. What's the maximum character? What's the pattern length? I don't like playing complicated Mastermind games, so I think I'm going to choose to have B and 2. Makes it pretty easy to guess the answer. And the way this thing works, you actually have to tell it where to talk the REST interface that is serving this. And that's running right now in my local host, in my Tomcat server. It's actually Java, not Node.js, which is part of the reason it was such a pain last night. But that's what we got going. So I will expect to have to enter in a couple of letters here. AA, let's see if that works. I make a guess. Okay, so it looks like the blue is inexact match and the green is exact match. So one of them matched exactly. Then there's one A, in other words. So I think I got 2 possibilities here. I got BA or AB. And looks like I guessed wrong because there's 2 inexact matches, so A, B, and we're done. And it shows me my history. It took me 3 moves, and if you didn't notice, it was clocking my time. It took me 68 seconds to play that game. And it tells me when I got the game played. And if I want to, I can expand it, and it will show me what the actual pattern was and what my history of moves was. So a little UI to play around with here, right? All this being done with just HTML, animated by an appropriate library. And if I start a game again, obviously I get another game. I hope it's not the same one. It's randomly possible. There's 1B. Let's find out. Oh, okay. So I think it's the same one, isn't it? Yeah, well, 1 chance in 4. Did you notice, by the way, that it was quit game and start game? When I do that, it changes to quit game, and if I just don't want to play it, I click it again, and it goes back to start game. So I can quit a game anytime I want. Right? And only the ones that I completed get shown in the history. Okay. Language, by the way, lets you pick a language, and it says that it's switching to that and doesn't do anything else. So it's not internationalized. We just put it in there for fun of it. Okay? Yeah. Yeah.
What is the HTTPS getting crossed out?
Oh, that is because the server I have right now is configured for IHS work, and it works in secure protocol. But the certificate it offers, being just a local machine, is not trustworthy. And so it's saying we're talking HTTPS to a not invalid, but non-trusted certificate, right? Do we want to do a digression on that at some point? I don't know how much people know about what I just said. How many people here understood what the hell I just said? Okay, about a third or so. Okay. Let me put a note to do a certain discussion at a break point. We'll kind of do that at some point here. Probably tonight we can get that. Talk a little bit about that issue. Okay, any other questions on the UI and what it does? Okay, so with that then, let's talk about how all this animation occurs, because, let me show you one thing before we do that. Interesting. I do have an mmind HTML file that we'll go over, and it lays out a lot of what you're just seeing, right? But it's a little bit instructive to see what that looks like without any life. So the important thing that makes it alive is right up there, another one of those new mmind.configure things, just like we looked at before, but rather more complicated. Let's just take that out of there momentarily. And I will pick this up if I can do it right. Let's see. REST Ajax, that's the wrong one. It's down in local game service. Different versions of this thing as you'll find in the recorded lecture. There. That's all there really is going on here. These are just buttons. They don't do anything except that they click like HTML buttons will. There's nothing here but I can do simply game history. There's nothing there. The menus are really just unnumbered lists with unnumbered lists nested inside of them, and they don't go anywhere, right? So this is just a dead skeleton. There's the bottom there that has game duration, but it doesn't run. Nothing's happening, right? But that's what we start with. And how do we animate that then? Here's the question. Now, jQuery provides a lot of power for wrapping elements and attaching them and putting event handlers on them and all that, but it doesn't do full UI. It doesn't like make things that accordion now open and shut the way you were looking at with the history and all. That requires more than just jQuery. It requires jQuery UI. The names are so similar that you tend to think of them as part and parcel of the same thing, but jQuery UI is an add-on to jQuery. And you include it separately as a library, right? And it provides a number of controls or widgets either one is used depending on what kind of UI or kind of GUI design you're accustomed to. But the term widget or control is used in GUI to mean an animated piece like an accordion control or a button that actually does things or lists and so forth, right? Menus. jQuery UI. It has its main documentation at jQueryui.com, and I would suggest you bring it up yourself while we're talking here. So if you've got a machine that you can use, please bring up jQueryui.com. Nice pretty documentation. Various different things in here. We won't get into all of them. But some of the stuff you can include here are configurations that have different animations. It's got a lot of UII candy in it that you don't necessarily use. But the important thing is the widgets. That's what we'll be working with. Accordion, for instance, is the widget I used for that history where it expands and contracts a stack of things. So if you want to look at any one of those, you go to this demo page, first of all. And that shows you the widget at work. So you can click these. That's what it does. And each of the widgets, by the way, has a different set of configurations. So for instance, maybe I want to customize the icons, and I use different icons here than the one that comes with for the expand and contract. Or maybe I want to allow it to have totally collapsed content. The one that you were looking at required one of them always to be open. But if I want to make it so that you can close all of them, then that's a subtle variation in its behavior. So there's a lot of different options you have on these. So what is exactly going on then to make this work? Well, they also give you an illustrative source view. And the source view has HTML, and then in the script at the top, a function that sets the accordion up, or whatever control it is. So the HTML that we're looking at is just a series of titles, and those don't have to be H3, they can be any kind of tag, but the title in this case, and then a div for the thing to be expanded, and then another one and another div and another one and another div, and the entire set of pairs of header and content are put in a great big div, which you will want to give some sort of ID to because you're going to have to identify it in order to make it into an accordion. So I gave it the ID, or they gave it the ID, accordion. And then up in the code, to make that into this magically live thing, all you have to do is find it, first of all. So the $ using the selector pound accordion gets me a jQuery wrapper, and then call .accordion. And all sorts of options, right? We already saw how that works. You pass a JSON object so that you can define which options you want. And in this case, collapsible true was an option because that's the option I chose up there where I wanted to have it be fully collapsible. And that's in there. If I wanted to see a different thing, I can try like, I don't know, fill space. And now the code will show me how to do a fill space. And apparently I also have to do a accordion resizer. That doesn't matter right now, but the point is there's extra detail depending on the kind of option you use. Right? Back to default functionality here. How is this working exactly? What would you expect the accordion function to be doing to the jQuery object on which I called it? What goes on in that? If you had to write it, as we might actually do a little of next week, or the week after we had time, try our hand at building a control, what would you do? Any brave volunteers for this? Well, how does accordion work inside? What do you think it's doing to make this dead piece of HTML suddenly go bouncing around like that? Yeah.
Make an AJAX call to REST service
There's actually no REST service involved here. It's works with just the static HTML you have there. Now, if for some reason I wanted to fill that in with content from a server, I'd be making an AJAX call. But this is just all about the HTML. The closest analogy is the expander I showed you. Right?
It's going through the ID accordion and then collapsing each of the div
Okay.
per section.
Okay. What AJAX call? jQuery calls do you think it's making? And if I said AJAX earlier and misled you, apologies. I got stuff switching those around. But what jQuery calls do you think it makes to do that? For one thing, I'm going to be apparently expecting that if I touch this thing, or that one actually, it expands. So what does that take? Yeah? Either one? Yeah, it's going to have an event handler, a click listener. So it's apparently attaching click listening to each of the headers. And then this expand contract business, probably done with styles. There is a style that will let you display or hide, and it's going to be changing the styles of the different pieces depending on how or which one I clicked. Right? And for that matter, it also will change this little icon over here. You notice it's a down arrow when it's expanded, and then when I expand another one, it turns to a side arrow, and that one's a down arrow. So there's no magic here. All that's happening is that we're getting event handlers on the HTML, and then that event handler is tweaking styles, might be adding other pieces to the tree if it needs to, although often it gets by without that, and working accordingly. Did you notice that the accordion method is applied to the jQuery object, right? Because the $ produces jQuery wrapper. Right? So does that then mean that accordion is provided by jQuery? I was saying earlier that this is an add-on, and yet I'm looking right at a jQuery object, and I'm calling accordion on the jQuery object. Does that mean then that it's provided by jQuery? Wouldn't it have to be if it's a part of the jQuery object? You're probably shaking your head. Why not? Yeah, in fact, at some point that got added on, didn't it? And in fact, you should be able to even point in my code to the place where it got added. Wouldn't it, accordion, get added to, let's see, here's my mi.js file, actually HTML file, sorry, that's where it would be. On what line here did accordion wind up getting added to the jQuery class? Best guess. What do you think? Good.
The script source and then jQuery UI.
This guy. Okay. That's a bunch of JS. We can go look at it, but somewhere in there it says $accordion equals big nasty function. And actually, I just lied. It didn't say $accordion equals big nasty function. Why not? What would it have to have said? This is a JS question. I called it on a $jQuery object. That would mean either it is a member of every jQuery object, but I'd have to modify the jQuery constructor to tack it onto the object, and that's not going to happen. Or there's another way to do this. Where is it really being added? Prototype. It's on the prototype. The line will actually say $.prototype dot accordion equals this function. There's a line like that somewhere in what is in fact several thousand lines of code in that JS file. Right? That's how it happened. And likewise .dialog and .button and a bunch of other stuff that jQuery UI adds. Right? This, by the way, is a CSS file that has all the styles that jQuery uses. So there's a lot of them in there. And one of the jQuery UI uses, I'm sorry. There's a lot of them in there. And it's as good a time as any to talk about how you set up a jQuery UI include file. This is a big library. And you don't want to use all of it if you're not going to actually use the functions that it provides. So if maybe you don't want accordions, do you really want the JS that defines the accordion behavior in your load here? Remember, every line of code hurts because it has to be loaded. So if you go to the UI site, you'll find that there's a configuration tool. And you list in it which pieces you want. And then there's a bunch of different UI look and feels, all different colors, right? And you pick the one you want. And it gives you back this thing with just the CSS for the coloring you wanted, and that thing with just the functions that you're going to use. And that's why it is custom in each case. And you kind of build or roll your own subset of the jQuery UI library as you like. By the way, .min. Remember I talked about minification? That one really is minified. I promised I'd show you one at some point. Let's see if we can get one here. I think I have it down there. Yeah. Doesn't look like much of a library. It's only a few lines. Oh, yeah. So there's your jQuery UI library right there. Okay. That's minified. Lots of single letter variable names. Okay. No returns, no space, except where absolutely necessary. Got a comment, that's nice, but that's it. And the only reason it's as small as it even is that I snapshotted just a few pieces and used it on only the ones I wanted. Right. Yeah. Okay, why don't we take a break for 10, and we'll come back and talk some more about the Mastermind app itself. Sorry for the record lecture. We just began talking about the Mastermind app and talking about modal dialogues here. So modal refers to old-fashioned text UI. It used to be that you would go into a mode when you entered information, and the mode would require you to answer a few questions before you could get back to the normal command mode. So you'd have these little command interactions where there were sets of commands you could do. That was command mode, and you drop into a sub mode and do the dialogue thing, right? And then drop back out. Why do you want that, by the way? Why don't you just let people work the program while they're also trying to, well, do a login would be senseless, but why can't I have a registration going on while I'm also playing a game? What's the point of making a dialogue modal? Because almost, I'd say 95% of dialogues are that way. A few of them are modeless, where you can work them while you're also working the main application, but not many. It's a lot easier to code. If you allow something to be going on in a dialogue while the rest of the app is working, all sorts of complex interactions can occur. It's very hard to debug. So when you can reasonably require a user to just get this damn job done and then go back to what they were doing, you do that. How do you think it's freezing the browser here, by the way? This is jQuery UI at work. It looks like it's locked the browser, doesn't it? All it did was make a great big HTML div that is styled to fill the entire area, has a z-index that's positive, so it stands above the rest of it, and it's semi-transparent and striped. And every time you hit it, the event goes to it instead of to what you're hoping the event would go to. Right? It's like a big glass panel, that's all it's doing. But it has the effect you need. So we're going to look at several modal dialogues and talk about the design of modal dialogues in general that follow a fairly standard pattern. Yeah.
Is there a max Z then?
I don't know that there's a max other than perhaps a max int. If I recall, this one stands at about 200, so it's probably ahead of just about anything you're going to do.
Yeah, but you could have like
You could mess it up. If I set a Z high enough, then it would pop up above the modal. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Isn't it possible to like use the Chrome debugger and just get it effective?
Oh, sure, sure. None of this is meant to really block you from doing obscure things, but if you're using the Chrome debugger, you got what's coming to you. The average user will be protected from messing it up, and that's good enough. Okay. Let's start with a simple one. This. The HTML for this is, again, already provided, and all this dialog does is give you a message and then say, OK, right? And it's got a title. The HTML for this is already provided in the HTML file. It's the notice dialog. It's a div that has a title, and then a class dialog template, which does nothing more than say what the boundary will be and what the background color will be. You may notice they were a light blue and background color, all the dialogues. This dialog template is the standard for that, the class CSS for that. So it doesn't get a lot to it. There is, however, a notice dialog.js. Now, you create a notice dialog in the code if you want to put one up, and you get the thing finding the notice dialog div and saving that with a jQuery wrapper. And then when you want to do the actual pop-up, you call run notice dialog.html. HTML is a jQuery and also an HTML element function that sets the internal text of any div and does so in a way that will not allow hacked up HTML to mess with it. So it's better than an alternative, which is just text. And we're going to put whatever notice we want in there. So when you do a .run, notice dialog.run, and you say, switching to Chinese, that goes in there. And then very importantly, we do this. That's a jQuery UI function. If you want to make a div into a dialog, you just call .dialog on it. And it does all the magic necessary to make that div into a dialog. Again, what do you think it's going to do? That div isn't even part of the HTML body right now. How is it going to make it into a dialog that stands up in the center and has a big plate behind it? It's going to work the DOM, basically. It's going to take that div. It's going to reparent it to probably the main body would be my guess. I'm not sure. And then it's going to also put behind it, along with it, another div that is the right Z distance. And of course, the dialog div is going to be at 201, right? It's going to be in front of that. It's going to do all that shifting of style necessary to make this happen. It is also going to add buttons. We didn't have an OK button in the HTML, as you may have noticed. But your standard dialog will have buttons. And the parameter, the JSON parameter for the dialog call, first says modal true. You can make it false if you want, but that's the option true we want. And then an array of buttons. And each button is a JSON object describing what the face of the button will look like and a function to call when the button is clicked. And this thing will set up a click handler on a button, again, that it spontaneously creates and adds to the HTML for the dialog. This does a .dialog close. Right? Now, this deserves a bit of an aside. How do we do function calls on the jQuery UI thing? I have a dialog that's up there and I want to make it close. You'd think that there might be like a close dialog function I would call in the jQuery UI object, or the jQuery object, but that's not the way it's done. The control, the dialog control, the accordion control, they each add exactly one function, dialog, accordion, and nothing more, for the same reason that we, in general, try to avoid polluting the function space. Lots of other people may be adding themselves to the jQuery class. And the way you do different operations on the control, if you want to, like closing a dialog, is that you call the function again with a string describing the operation you want to do. Rather confusingly, jQuery UI refers to these as methods, but they're no such thing. There's only one method, which is dialog. And then there are string qualifiers you can pass to make it do different things. So you can pass dialog nothing, or I'm sorry, an initial JSON object, speaking more carefully here, that means set up the dialog initially. Here's your configuration. But you can also pass it various different single strings to do operations on it. And the jQuery documentation gives you details on that. Accordion, for instance. If you looked at the main API, which is pointed to off of the page that was the demo page we were looking at, the API documentation for each jQuery UI looks like this. They're all the same. Those are the options that you can pass in the initial constructor. These are the methods you can call. You pass these as literal strings. to the function, and it will do that operation. You can destroy the thing, you can disable it, turn it off for a while, re-enable it, and so forth. And then there are events you can also arrange to listen for if you want to have some outside of the object itself control over what's going on and respond to stuff that's happening in it. A particularly interesting method is option itself. These options you can set when you create the thing, but if you want to change them later on, you can do so by passing quote option quote and then a JSON list of changed options. Well, I think at one point or another in the code we do that. So the short version here, it's a lot of detail I know, is the way you do things to jQuery UI elements is you pass these strings that are kind of mock method names. And it will perform that action and sometimes extra parameters after that if it needs it. And you look those up here and it'll tell you how to do them. So this is closing the dialog, which I kind of would expect when I hit OK. It's not automatic. You have to make it happen. And so that's my handler. What about this, though? $sign this dialog close. Why did I have to do all of that? Okay, so I want to close this dialog, right? And it's the dialog that is attached to my div that was my notice dialog div, right? The div that I did that to right up there. What will this be, do you think, in the click function handler? Now it's a little, you have to guess a little bit here, but apparently this is going to be a function handler. That's why it's called click, and the jQuery UI library will attach it as a click handler. You can count on that. In that event, what will this be? We were talking about it just a minute ago. If you have a handler, an event handler, and it is called, it has as its context object some random, let's see, Gideon, what do you think?
This is an HTML element.
Good.
So it doesn't actually have dialog close.
Right. Good. Does everybody understand that? This is an HTML element, the div, on which the event occurred. Actually, to be, yeah, HTML element, the div on which the event occurred, and I need to wrap it because otherwise there is no dialog function. It would just be an HTML element. Now it's a jQuery object, and now I can call close on it. Okay, that's my notice dialog. Let's try something a little more complicated though. Login dialog. Now, this thing is operating off of the HTML for login dialog, which is right here. It's got a title like the other one, but now it's got some divs within it. And dialog row is another class that lays out a row where there's a title and then an entry. So the title is login, and then over here is another div with the input and labeled login. This is where you enter your login, your email. And next one similarly for password. So it's a little more elaborate layout. And we already know what it looks like. We've seen it come up when I was logging in, so that's what the appearance will be. And what we will do is get the dialog wrapper for the entire thing, and then I want individual wrappers for the login, password, and error list within them, the inputs. Right? I'll wrap those separately. This CSS notation, anybody know what one thing followed by another like that means? Right. So it's a parent-child relationship, not immediate necessarily. That says, find the div labeled login dialog, and then underneath it, as a child or subchild or sub-subchild, somewhere underneath it, find another one that has got the ID login. It might be that login is used other places in the HTML, so this helps you narrow down the scope. Okay. My run method, if I run this dialog, is going to take the server URL, because the login dialog is expected to go and actually try a login, right? It's going to post a session. And a callback to be called when the login is successfully done. We're going to have a use of self in the click function, so I have to do or use of this, so I have to do self equals this. I'm going to empty out an error list. There was an error list at the bottom. I didn't show you that, but that's there. I'm going to save off the callback. I'm going to save the server URL, and then I'm going to do another dialog call. Here I want the width a little higher, so I made it 500. It's still modal, and I still have my OK button, but also a cancel button. The OK button calls self.OK. The login dialog class has an OK method that deals with making that AJAX call. The cancel button is much simpler, and it just closes the dialog like the OK button did earlier, and with no other action. So the interesting thing will be if we do click OK, and we have our login and password to try applying. AJAX call. Take the server URL, add in the /SSN. Assemble a body comprising the login and password. Those were the jQuery wrappers on those fields I'm going to use. Make it cross-domain for reasons, like we said, that are a little obscure. Do a post. If it's successful, call login success, otherwise login error. These callbacks, for login success in particular, will do the same stuff we were looking at, recall, from get my mastermind attempts. It's the same logic, so I don't even need to go over it in great detail. We'll either have successfully gotten the name of the person or failed to do so. So let's see here. If we failed the login, then we'll log to the console so that we can debug a little bit. And if it's a 401, we'll add to our error list the login and password are not recognized. Otherwise, if it's something else, we'll add a general error, and that'll appear at the bottom of the dialog. If it's a success in getting the name after we've done the login, then if there is a callback, if it was given, it could have been null, then we will call it back with the person's first name and last name and URI, and that is the body that comes back from the second call where we're getting the person. And then finally, after all that, we'll close the dialog. Otherwise, if there is an error, we'll say we had a problem getting the name of the person who was logged in. So let's see here. Thus, now there was an AJAX call made there, and it came back, and it went to that call that put the error message in there. Or ultimately, if I succeeded at doing it, I won't do that because I'm already logged in, it sets up information. The callback that I'll give it will set up my information, like what my attempts are and so forth. So any questions about the login dialog? Okay. Options dialog. This one's a little more classic, and the login dialog has all the AJAX stuff. The options dialog follows the kind of standard pattern of dialogues everywhere, and that is that there is an object that's supposed to fill in. Very often when you have a dialog like the options, there is an object that goes with it. My params object, remember it had the fields that corresponded to the dialog's entry content? So the classic pattern is you set a dialog up, you give it an object to fill in. If there's already content in the object, that goes into the fields of the dialog. User then manipulates the fields of the dialog and either cancels, in which case you do nothing, or has OK, in which case you go through and look at the fields as they currently are and repopulate the object with changed data. And probably error check as well, and post errors if there's a problem. Otherwise, If all is well, you close the dialog, and your object now has changed content. So dialog run as object alterer is a very standard model. And this spans beyond web design. Any GUI system you're going to deal with will often follow this pattern. An important point about it is that it is not true that every single user action on the controls in the dialog is event handled. You let the user go and mess around with it all they want to without checking them at all until they click OK. And then one time you go through and look at it all and make sure it's OK and it meets the rules. So with that background in mind, we're doing the same kind of thing we did before. We're going to get a bunch of wrappers for the dialog itself and then all the different fields. But they are going to have different kinds of controls. And the control you put in a dialog depends on the kind of data you want. If it's a Boolean, you're going to have a checkbox. If it's a enum, you might have a radio button. If it's an integer, you'll have probably an entry box or maybe a spinner if you want to use that. So different kinds of controls for different types of data. When I do the run here, I'm passing it the params on which to operate. I'm going to save that. And then I'm going to take the character choices. That's the choice of max character, A, B, C, D, E, F. Visually here, that is this thing. And I'm going to turn that into a button set. So illustrating that jQuery UI. And for the pattern length, I'm going to turn it into a spinner. That's one of those deals where I can press this up or down. And I can even give it a maximum and a minimum, so it can't be wrong. And here I'm going to make it a edit box for the server URL. So going back to the code there. $pound char choices. Dot button set. That's the jQuery UI. Makes it a button set and we're done. Char choices max plus, and we're going to do a, okay, yeah. The character choices have individual labels. We've got to look at that. Hold on. So we didn't really look at the code for this. Let's look at that first. Here's the options dialog. I have a max char label and then a char choices ID. This is the thing that the button set jQuery UI will operate on. And I give it each possible radio button value, and it turns it into something better than an HTML radio button. And each one has an ID, max B, max C, max D, and so forth. And so remember that. This gets turned into that panel of buttons you saw. And then what we're going to do is take the number of letters and see. Okay, we're going to construct params.numLetters is the number of letters that currently is in the param. So if we start with 4 letters, and that's our choice, that would be choice D, right? Max letter. And we're going to add to that the character code at A -1, so that if it's A, then we'll add nothing to it, but see, we'll add it. Should have thought through the explanation of this better. If the number of letters that we're allowing is 4, we should get D. That's the ASCII code for A, 65. Less 1, 64. Plus 4, 68, which is the code for D. 5, 6, 7, 8. So the -1 is handling an off by 1 situation. And I'll get the letter that corresponds to the number of letters in the parameter. I'm going to then use that and get an actual string for it, literally A, B, C, D, not number. Add that to max, and that becomes my style CSS selector, so that the net result is I get a pound char choices, pound max A, max B, well, it wouldn't be A actually, max B, max C, max D. One of the IDs for the button choices. And then I'm going to do a dot prop on that and set its property. That's a jQuery method to set the property of checked to true. And when you set a choice of radio buttons checked property to true in HTML, that means it is the one that is selected. Then finally, I'm going to do a button set refresh call. Now there's a pattern here that we'll see a little later. If you change the underlying HTML that a jQuery UI control has gone and wrapped and maybe added more stuff to and all, it doesn't automatically update the control's behavior. You need to call refresh, which is in effect saying, go look at that HTML again. And because we've added a check property, we needed to do that. I'll show you the actual result of not doing so in a code we'll get to in a little bit, so back to that later. The spinner. We have to take, let's see, what is this? This dot pattern length dot val of params dot pattern length. So I'm getting the pattern length and taking its value and setting it to the current pattern length. So the dot val method of a text entry can get the current value of it, but also set it by passing a value to it. And then it is changed, so it is still the same jQuery object, but I've set its value now to whatever the current thing is, like maybe 2. And now I'm making a spinner out of it. And the spinner has properties max and min, which are derived from the params. I don't know if you noticed, I pointed it out briefly, there were 2 constants in the params class for the maximum, minimum of 2 and 8. So I'm using that here. And aside on this issue, val gets me the value of an edit box, right? If I give it no parameters. If I give it a parameter, it sets the value in the edit box instead. That's a design pattern that you'll see in other libraries, in other languages even. It was fashionable in the early 2000s and has fallen out since. These days, if you're going to get the value of something, you have a get method, get val. And if you're going to set it, you have a set method, set val. Getters and setters, right? But for a while, it looked like a smart idea to have an overloaded single method that was the value, the name of the property. And if you passed no parameter, then that overloaded version would give you the current property. But if you passed a parameter, that overloaded version would set the thing. And so you have, in some cases, code like this, where it's .val, either to get it or set it, and the only difference is whether you pass a parameter or not. Again, not a very good design standard, but you see it now and then. That sets up the pattern length. And then finally, very simply, the server URL, I'll push in the value of the current params. Now, the net result, stepping back here, is we have set up the UI controls, but we've also populated them with the current values of params. That's stage 1, right? You set the dialog up, you fill the controls in with what got right now. Then we'll let people work on them, and there's no event handling for that. You can sit and punch the radio buttons and run the spinner. When I was doing all that, no JS code was running. Well, at least not at the level of my code. Something in the jQuery UI library might have been running to manage the things I was doing. But I'm not checking that or worrying about it until OK is pressed. I run the dialog. My OK, again, because it's a complicated action, calls self.OK. I have an OK method in my dialog class. Same deal here. I can refetch the wrapper and close it if the cancel is set. So this is the same as it was in earlier dialogs. My OK. First, I'm going to parse the value in this .pattern length. That's the spinner, and get that as my new length. I'm going to set up some errors. We'll look at this other stuff in a minute. I'm going to check to be sure that my new length is in bounds. And I'll add an error to the list of error strings if it's not. The alert reader will have noticed that that can't really happen, right, because the spinner is controlled. But still, it's good to check it. If errors.length, if there's a problem, then I'm going to clean it out and append all of the errors back onto it. The error list is the list in the dialog that I have for showing any errors down at the bottom. It's the only error I can get at this point. So it's really more illustrative of the general pattern. This might have been a much more complicated error check in a different dialog. But the pattern is check for errors, post your errors, or otherwise take the values and put them back into the params that you originally had, repopulating from the controls back to the object, and then finally close the dialog. This thing here, I don't know if I'll go into in detail, but it walks through the radio controls radio set and finds out which one is checked and sets the value accordingly. We're running out of time on this, so I won't go into that in more detail. That, mercifully, is the end of our dialogue discussion. Be sure you get the general principles. You set up a dialogue with the initial HTML. You can add jQuery UI to it. You take an object generally, populate the dialogue, let it run, check it with an OK at the end. You can follow the patterns I have here for dialogues of your own and use them as a model. Tell people are starting to glaze over here. We have a very large one to discuss, and that is the mmine.js, which is, and that's kind of the culminating thing. Why don't we take a 10-minute break and come back and then look at that.